Hey guys, welcome to The Last Hike, and today I'll go over what happened when a Karen on a first date cried wolf and got a rafting guide fired. Her entitlement sent that raft drifting downstream without anyone at the helm, and what the river in Colorado did to her in those rushing rapids will stop you cold. It was June 14th, 2018. The Arkansas River runs through the heart of south-central Colorado, cutting through a canyon called Browns Canyon just outside the small town of Buena Vista. Buena Vista sits at about 8,000 feet above sea level, nestled between the Collegiate Peaks to the west and the Sangre de Cristo Range to the east. The town has a population of maybe 3,000 people on a normal day, but during the rafting season, which runs from late May through August, depending on snowmelt, it can feel like the whole country has shown up with a dry bag and a bucket list. Browns Canyon is a national monument now, and it's one of the most popular whitewater destinations in the entire country. Thousands of people float that stretch every year, from nervous first-timers on guided group trips to experienced kayakers running technical lines solo. The commercial outfitter industry there is well-established, heavily regulated, and safety-focused in ways that go well beyond what most tourists ever think about. I've spent time looking into how these trips are run, and the level of operational detail is genuinely impressive. Every guide is certified. Every life jacket or personal flotation device, PFD, in the industry's language is fitted individually to each guest before the trip. Weight limits, water temperature protocols, swimmer rescue procedures, it's all documented, trained, and audited. The outfitters operating in Browns Canyon don't survive on luck. They survive on reputation and compliance. That context matters a lot for what happened that day. I want you to hold it in your head, not just as background flavor, but as a structural fact. The system in place was a good one. What went wrong was not the absence of safety infrastructure. It was a series of decisions made inside that infrastructure that dismantled it piece by piece. On the morning of June 14th, the outfitter running this particular trip, I'll call them the company throughout, had a full day of multi-raft groups heading out on a half-day section that included a stretch of Class 3 and Class 4 rapids. For context, Class 3 water means moderate waves and clear channels that require maneuvering. Class 4 steps that up significantly. Powerful, churning water, more complex routes, less room for error. You can absolutely run Class 4 in a guided group raft. People do it every summer. But it demands that everyone on that raft follow the guide's instructions, stay seated, keep their PFD on, and listen. The guide assigned to one of the rafts that morning was a man named Tom Sobolov. Tom was in his late 20s at this point, and he had been guiding in Colorado for several seasons. He wasn't a rookie. He knew the river, knew the equipment, and by all accounts from the company's internal records and later investigative documentation, he had a solid track record. No prior incidents, no complaints on file, no disciplinary history. He was the kind of guide you'd actually want on your raft. Miriam McDade was on his raft, along with her date, a man I'll call Devin, and several other guests. Miriam was 53 years old, originally from the Phoenix area, and she was visiting Colorado on what appeared to be a leisure trip. She had booked the rafting experience a few days in advance through the company's standard reservation system. Nothing in the booking records flagged any medical conditions or swimming ability concerns, which customers are asked to disclose at the time of booking and again during pre-trip check-in. Whether or not she had read through those pre-trip materials carefully is something we simply don't know. A lot of people don't. They skim past the liability waiver, nod along during the safety briefing, and assume the life jacket is mostly there for show. On most trips, on most days, nothing bad happens, and that assumption never gets tested. That day on the Arkansas, it got tested hard. Before any raft leaves the staging area, every guest gets fitted for a personal flotation device or PFD. You have to understand that this isn't a handshake deal where they toss you a vest and wish you luck. The guide, or a staging assistant, physically fits the device to the guest's body, checks the buckles, tests the snugness, and makes sure the PFD will stay in place in the water. There's a reason for all of that. A loose PFD can ride up over a swimmer's face in moving water. A PFD that isn't buckled properly can come off entirely. The fitting process exists because the physics of whitewater don't care about comfort levels. According to the incident report that was later reviewed during the investigation, Miriam had difficulties during the fitting process. The standard PFD issued to her was correctly sized for her body weight, but she expressed discomfort with how it felt specifically, that it was too tight across the chest. Tom adjusted it. She said it was still too tight. He adjusted it again. This back and forth lasted long enough that it drew attention at the staging area, with other guests and staff aware that something was taking longer than usual. At this point, before Tom had even finished the second adjustment, Miriam began complaining about the appearance of the PFD itself. She made repeated comments that the vest looked old and worn, pointing at faded stitching and minor cosmetic scuffs that had no bearing on the device's functionality. Several staging employees later recalled her demanding to see a newer life jacket, as if she were returning a defective product at a department store. When staff explained that all PFDs met the same safety certifications regardless of cosmetic condition, she rolled her eyes and muttered something under her breath about how this place was clearly cutting corners. During this process, Miriam began to escalate, not physically, but vocally. She was loud about her discomfort, dismissive about what she characterized as Tom's inability to solve the problem, and according to at least one account documented in the investigation, she made comments to a staging supervisor that implied Tom didn't know what he was doing. What we can't know for certain is whether she genuinely believed the PFD was improperly fitted, or whether she simply found it uncomfortable in the way that any properly fitted PFD will feel uncomfortable snug, slightly restrictive, not designed for casual lounging. The two are very different problems with very different solutions. But I get that they can feel identical to someone who has never worn one before and has no framework for what correct is supposed to feel like. Unfortunately, they got a Karen in their hands. Before the staging supervisor even arrived, Miriam had already started making comments to other guests in the raft area, attempting to rally them to her side. She asked a young couple nearby whether their PFDs felt dangerously tight, and when they said theirs seemed fine, she told them they must not know what to look for. She also made a point of announcing loudly that she had left a bad review for a different outfitter last year and would have no problem doing the same here. The other guests later described feeling embarrassed for her, not threatened by her, but the performance continued regardless. There's also a third possibility worth acknowledging, that Miriam understood on some level that the PFD was fine, but that pushing back on it was a way of asserting control in a situation where she felt she had none. This is not a psychology podcast, and I'm not going to armchair diagnose anyone here. But the pattern of behavior resistance, escalation, demanding a personnel change follows a recognizable script. It's the script of someone who is accustomed to getting what they want through social pressure and is deploying that skill in a context where it has no place. I want you to watch carefully, because what happens next is the part that set everything else in motion. The staging supervisor, a man I'll call Garrett, came over to assess the situation. Miriam immediately shifted her complaints from the equipment to Tom's demeanor. She claimed, without any corroboration, that Tom had been rude to her and had rolled his eyes when she first asked for an adjustment. Garrett later testified that he saw no evidence of this and that Tom had remained professional throughout. But Miriam pressed harder, insisting that she did not feel safe with Tom and that if the company forced her to raft with him, she would demand a full refund and contact her credit card company to dispute the charge. The word refund came up multiple times in the staging area that morning. Again, the investigation documents this, though the full picture had to be reconstructed from multiple sources since Miriam herself was not available to give a statement afterward. Garrett's own account, given to both company management and later to investigators, was that Miriam's complaints were persistent and that she requested Tom be removed from her raft. Whether that request was phrased politely or not is not really something I can verify, but the outcome is documented. Garrett made the call to reassign the guests on Tom's raft to another guide, and Tom was pulled from his shift. That decision to remove a certified, experienced guide based on a guest complaint during the pre-launch safety process is one that I think deserves real scrutiny, and we'll come back to it. But first, let's talk about what it means for a guide to be pulled mid-staging. In the operational structure of a commercial outfitter, the staging supervisor has a significant amount of discretionary authority. They're responsible for the overall safety and smooth function of the launch process, and they have to make judgment calls quickly. On one hand, if a guest and a guide have a genuine interpersonal conflict that can't be resolved, splitting them up can be a reasonable move. On the other hand, the safety fitting process is not a customer service interaction. It is a literal safety procedure. Tom, by the account in the investigation, did not argue. He handed off his raft to another guide, a less experienced staff member I'll call Ruben, and stepped back. The trip launched, and Tom stood at the staging area and watched it go. Apparently, Miriam made a point of watching him walk away with what witnesses described as a satisfied expression. She then turned to Devin, her date, and said something in a low voice that made him shift uncomfortably. One guest in an adjacent raft later recalled hearing Miriam say, "That's how you get things done," as if she had just successfully negotiated a hotel room upgrade rather than having a trained professional removed from a safety-critical position. Devin, by all accounts, did not respond. If I were him, I'd want to disappear into the raft floor, but I want to sit with that image for a second here too. Tom was a professional. He knew that raft, that group, that river. He had been in the middle of a safety-critical task when he was pulled from it. He complied, because that's what a professional does when a supervisor makes a call, even a bad one. But he also knew, at least in general terms, that the PFD situation on that raft had not been fully resolved. What he did or didn't say in those final moments at the staging area isn't documented in a way I can report as fact. But the investigation found that no adequate communication bridge was built between him and Ruben before the raft went into the water. What the investigation later zeroed in on was the question of what happened to the PFD situation when the handoff occurred. Tom had been in the middle of a fitting dispute. He knew the status of that PFD better than anyone else on the property at that moment. Ruben, stepping in cold, was receiving a group of guests mid-process, with no briefing on what was unresolved and why it mattered. The documentation from the incident report suggests that no clear communication occurred between Tom and Ruben about the unresolved PFD status. Whether that was a procedural failure on the company's part, a communication breakdown between the two guides, or simply the chaos of a rushed handoff that nobody had prepared a protocol for, the result was the same. Ruben launched with a guest whose PFD compliance was, at best, an open question. I want to be careful here because I'm not in the business of assigning blame to Ruben. He was put in an unfair position. He stepped up when asked, took a group he didn't know, and did his job, but the outcome is what it is. The trip proceeded normally for the first part of the run. Browns Canyon's lower sections ease you in before the water gets serious, and a well-guided group can build confidence and settle into the rhythm of paddling before the bigger features arrive. There's something almost counterintuitive about the early miles of that run. The river looks deceptively manageable. The canyon walls are gorgeous, the water is clear, and if you've never been in real whitewater before, you might look at the first few ripples and think the whole thing was overblown. That relaxation can be dangerous, because the river doesn't stay mellow. Ruben was a certified guide. He knew the river. The other guests on the raft were, by all indications, following instructions and paddling cooperatively. Miriam, though, appears to have been a problem on the water as well, based on the plausibility assessments made during the investigation. Given the pattern established at staging the complaints, the resistance, the escalation, investigators considered it plausible, and I think reasonably so, that she may have continued to be non-compliant on the raft. This is inferred from physical evidence and witness statements from the other guests, not from direct observation. No one was watching her every move throughout the entire trip, but the picture that emerges suggests someone who had not fully bought into the safety framework she was operating inside. The other guests on the raft later described the trip as tense in a way they couldn't fully articulate, which isn't surprising. It's hard to explain why a dynamic feels off when you can't point to one specific thing. Tense is the word that came up more than once. One specific point that came up repeatedly in the investigation was the state of her PFD during the on-water portion of the trip. Without a confirmed resolution to the fitting issue at staging, and given the handoff that occurred, investigators assessed it as plausible that Miriam's PFD was not properly secured for at least some portion of the trip. Again, this is reconstruction based on physical evidence and the circumstances of what was found later, confirmed by a direct witness who saw her on the water at that specific moment. The Class 4 section of this particular run is a stretch that the guides know intimately. The features there are consistent. They're shaped by canyon walls and bedrock, not shifting sandbars, so experienced guides can read the water and position the raft to avoid the worst hydraulics. A hydraulic, sometimes called a hole, is a recirculating feature at the base of a drop where water curls back upstream and can trap and hold a swimmer. Getting caught in a hydraulic is the kind of thing that kills people even when they're wearing their PFD properly. Without one, the math changes dramatically. The investigation was unable to reconstruct exactly what happened at the rapid. What it could establish was a sequence of facts. The raft entered the rapid section with all guests and the guide aboard, and it exited without Miriam. The raft did not capsize. No other guests went overboard. Ruben was present and functional on the raft when shore staff observed the raft coming through downstream. The most plausible scenario, and the one the investigation treated as the most likely based on physical evidence, was that Miriam went over the side of the raft during the rapid section and was immediately separated from the group. How that happened, whether she was thrown by a wave, stood up at the wrong moment, shifted her weight unexpectedly, failed to brace properly, or some combination of factors, cannot be stated with certainty. What can be said is that she entered the water in a Class 4 environment, and her PFD situation made survival in that environment significantly less likely than it would have been for a guest in proper compliance. A human body in cold, fast, technical water has very few resources available to it. Proper buoyancy is at the top of that list. Without it, the river doesn't give you much to work with. Ruben, for his part, faced an impossible split-second situation, the kind of high-stakes, life-or-death moment that river guides train for but hope never actually comes. Imagine this. You have a raft full of guests, each one trusting you with their safety. You have moving water, churning and unpredictable, with hidden rocks and currents. And you have a person in the river suddenly separated from the craft and at the mercy of the flow. In that instant, Ruben's mind had to process dozens of variables: the speed of the water, the weight of the raft, the location of hazards, and the desperate cries of the swimmer. His immediate responsibility, as any certification course would teach, was to the guests still on the raft, the ones he could still protect, the ones who had not yet been lost to the current. Recovering a swimmer overboard while simultaneously managing a fully loaded raft through technical water is simply not a one-person job. It requires a coordinated team and a calm environment. The standard protocols for that exact situation, protocols developed from decades of accident analysis and expert consensus, involve first getting the raft to calm water, then securing the raft against further drift or flip, and only then initiating swimmer recovery procedures. They do not involve abandoning the raft and jumping in after someone in the middle of a rapid, because doing so would almost certainly leave the remaining guests unguided and at even greater risk. Ruben followed those protocols to the letter. He did what the protocols required, even as every human instinct might have screamed to dive in after the lost person. Whether that was the right call in a human sense, a moral, emotional, gut-level sense, and whether it was the right call in a technical, procedural, risk management sense are two separate conversations, each with its own weight. I won't pretend to have a simple answer here. I'll let you decide on that for yourself. When a raft reaches the takeout point, what outfitters call the termination staging area shore staff are waiting. They're doing a head count, logging arrivals, helping guests out of the water, and managing the end-of-trip process. The company's protocols required that every raft arrive with the same number of guests that launched. This sounds obvious, but it's a hard count every time, because the alternative is the scenario where someone is missing and no one notices until hours later. When Ruben's raft arrived, shore staff flagged the discrepancy immediately. A guest was unaccounted for. Ruben, from everything in the documentation, reported what had happened to the best of his knowledge. The company's emergency protocols activated right away, and I do want to give them credit for that. Shore staff coordinated with river authorities, initiated contact with search and rescue, and began locking down the incident for documentation. The clock that matters in a missing swimmer situation is very short. Cold water, strong current, and the mechanics of drowning don't wait for bureaucratic processes. Devin Miriam's date, the man who had accompanied her to the river that day, was present at the termination staging area, along with the other guests who had been evacuated from the raft trip. He did not vanish, he did not make a scene, and he did not seek attention. Instead, he gave a brief, straightforward statement to the company guides and to the responding authorities who arrived on the scene. That statement was short, factual, and cooperative. Nothing more, nothing less. He did not speak to the media. Not a single reporter, not a single camera, not a single quote attributed to him in any news outlet. That's consistent across everything I found in my own review of the incident. No interviews, no social media posts, no public commentary whatsoever. He was transported separately from the other guests, which may have been by design or by circumstance, I don't know, and I'm not speculating. Once at the staging area, he answered the questions he was asked, gave whatever information he had, and then stepped back. And that was the extent of his visible involvement in what came after, the aftermath, the investigation, the media coverage, the quiet return to normal life. I'm not reading anything into that. I'm not implying he was cold or distant or unusually composed. I'm simply reporting what the record shows. He had just experienced something genuinely traumatic, a sudden, violent, life-altering event on the water, and he had no obligation to do anything else. No obligation to speak to reporters, no obligation to comfort strangers, no obligation to offer a public statement, no obligation to explain himself or his reaction to anyone. He showed up, he answered, and he withdrew. That is his right. That is more than enough. Search and rescue operations on a river like the Arkansas use a combination of physical searching and predictive modeling. The way moving water works, a submerged or floating object, how clinical that sounds when we're talking about a person, predictable paths based on current speed, channel shape, and the locations of eddies. An eddy is a section of calmer, slower water on the downstream side of an obstruction, like a boulder or a bend in the bank. Floating objects and, unfortunately, swimmers tend to collect in eddies. That's where search teams look first, and that's where they deploy the most resources. Teams deploy downstream from the last known position, working the eddy lines in slow water while other personnel walked the shoreline. The Arkansas in this stretch isn't a smooth, flat river even outside the rapid sections. It's technical, boulder-strewn, and the banks are rough enough that a shoreline search requires real effort and real footing. The canyon walls close in at certain points and make aerial observation complicated. It's not an easy environment to search, even when you know roughly what drift path to follow. Miriam was located several hours after the initial alert was broadcast to search and rescue teams. She was found in a slower eddy zone, a calm pocket of water downstream of the main rapid section, which was entirely consistent with the drift modeling that the search teams had used to predict where a swimmer would most likely be carried by the current. The fact that she ended up exactly where the models predicted is, in its own grim and sobering way, a testament to how well the teams knew their environment. Every bend, every boulder, every hydraulic feature that shapes the river's violent choreography. She was recovered by water-based search personnel who had been navigating the same technical channels, and she was transported to a staging area where medical professionals were waiting. Despite their efforts, she was pronounced dead at the scene. The official cause of death, as confirmed by the subsequent autopsy and incident review, was drowning specifically. Freshwater drowning in the cold, fast-moving flow of the Arkansas River, complicated by the fact that her personal flotation device was not properly secured at the time she entered the water. Her PFD, when examined, was found to be improperly secured. The specifics of that finding, which buckles, in what state are part of the incident documentation, but the headline is clear. It was not on her the way it should have been. Whether that was the state it was in when she entered the water, or whether it shifted or came loose during her time in the river, investigators considered both possibilities. But the weight of the physical evidence pointed toward a PFD that had not been properly fastened before the trip launched. That finding circled back directly to the staging dispute, the handoff, and the unresolved status that Reuben had never been told about. The raft was recovered separately downstream and logged as part of the incident record. The official incident classification noted both a procedural failure in the termination staging process, meaning the handoff from Tom to Reuben, without proper status communication and PFD noncompliance escalation, meaning the chain of events starting from the staging dispute. After the final report was filed and the outfitter's reputation took a lasting hit, it became painfully clear that Miriam's relentless need to assert control and demand special treatment didn't just cost a guide his job, it cost her the very people who could have helped her when the water turned deadly. Being a Karen doesn't just alienate strangers, it quietly dismantles the safety net of goodwill and patience around you, leaving you isolated at the exact moment you need others most.